Hello everyone. Next week is Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av. It's one of the saddest days in the Jewish calendar. It remembers all sorts of disasters, calamities that happened to the Jewish people, some of them all the way back to the time of the Torah or the Hebrew Bible, and then continuing on through history. According to Jewish tradition, all sorts of bad things have happened. It's not the most widely observed, widely commemorated day in the Jewish calendar. When Jews show up to synagogue or temple, it's the high holy days, or maybe it's Passover or Hanukkah. Tisha B'Av doesn't really get a whole lot of attention, and I think there's a lot of reasons for it. But that being said, I think it's worthy of attention, and certainly we should be thinking about some of the things that come up on Tisha B'Av, because Tisha B'Av really is remembering some of the darkest chapters of Jewish history. And part of being Jewish is connecting to the Jewish people and our story. Things have happened. Those could be good things, but also bad things. And there have been plenty of bad things over the last several thousand years. And a lot of those bad things get remembered on this day. We're going to be talking in a little bit about what some of those are. I did make a source sheet on Sefaria. The link is going to be in the description of the video, so you can click on that link and follow along pretty easily by looking at those source sheets along with the video, and it'll help you to follow along. Because what I'm going to do today is share some of the biblical and some of the rabbinic writings about Tisha B'Av to get a sense of what it is. So first up is something that comes from the Mishnah Ta'anit. It says, on the 9th of Av, it was decreed upon our ancestors that they would all die in the wilderness and not enter Eretz Yisrael. So that's referring to the story in the book of Numbers where the Israelites are in the wilderness and they're thinking about crossing over to the Promised Land, and a lot of them are getting pretty nervous, and they petitioned to have the scouts sent into the Promised Land ahead of them so that they could come back and report on what they see. 12 scouts were sent into the Promised Land, and of the 12, when they came back, 10 of them said, you know what, it's a great place to go, it's a great place to be, but it's not going to work out for us because there are giants there and we must seem like grasshoppers to them. And ultimately, 10 out of those 12 didn't have faith in God that everything would be okay when they went to the Promised Land. And they tried to convince the Israelites, don't do it. Now, 2 of the 12 said, it's going to be great, have faith in God. But the vast majority of everyone listened to those 10 scouts, and they got scared. They didn't want to go into the Promised Land. According to that story, that's when it was decided that the Israelites would stay for 40 years in the wilderness for that generation to die off before the Israelites went into the Promised Land. So that's calamity number 1, according to this Mishnah. Bad thing number 1 that happened. And, that's got to be a terrible thing. All these former slaves in the wilderness, and they just found out that for the rest of their life, that's where they're going to be. They're going to live and die in the wilderness. No Promised Land for them. So absolutely a disaster. Okay, moving on. And the temple was destroyed the first time. This is Solomon's temple. After they finally do get to the Promised Land, centuries later, along comes King Solomon. King Solomon builds a temple in Jerusalem. That's the first temple. According to the Mishnah, the first temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed on the 9th day of Av, on Tisha B'Av. That was in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. And the second time by the Romans. So the temple was eventually rebuilt. That was the second temple. And the second temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE by the Romans. That also, according to the Mishnah, happened on the 9th day of Av. Beitar was captured. That was a city in Israel. The city of Jerusalem was plowed, destroyed, as a sign that it would never be rebuilt. And not only does one fast on the 9th of Av, but from when the month of Av begins, one decreases acts of rejoicing because this is such a sad time. Now, this is the Mishnah. According to other places, and according to kind of history itself, all sorts of stuff can be said to have their origins or to have happened on Tisha B'Av. Lots of exiles. The exile from England, the exile from France, from Spain, and on and on and on. Various bad things always get put on the calendars happening on the 9th day of Av, on Tisha B'Av. So that's one of the things that's getting remembered on this day. There's a lot written in the Hebrew Bible about Tisha B'Av, but one of them comes from the book of Eicha, Lamentations. In fact, this whole book is about the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. And this is how it begins. It says, "Alas, lonely sits the city, once great with people. She that was great among nations is become like a widow. The princess among states is become a thrall. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There is none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her, they have become her foes. Judah has gone into exile because of misery and harsh oppression. When she settled among the nations, she found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. Zion's roads are in mourning, empty of festival pilgrims. All her gates are deserted. Her priests sigh. Her maidens are unhappy. She is utterly disconsolate." What a heavy text. What a sad text. And it's written obviously by somebody who has witnessed the destruction of their home, of Jerusalem, of the temple in Jerusalem. You know, it's not just the temple that gets destroyed, it's all of national life. The Babylonian Empire conquers Judah, destroys it. In front of this person's eyes, their entire country, their life, has been destroyed, and that shakes them to their core. And Lamentations is exactly what it sounds like. Alas, it's a lament for what used to be, for loss. And it's hauntingly beautiful in its own way, the words, but so disturbing also to think about what life must have been like for this person who wrote Lamentations. Okay, this is what I want to focus on, is from the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, Gittin, and it's a story about the destruction of the second temple. So when the temple's destroyed, it raises a question. If this is God's temple, I mean, it's the temple of Jews, but if it's God's temple, why isn't God protecting the temple? How could the temple be destroyed? Rabbi said that rabbinic tradition says that the second temple was destroyed because of something called sinat chinam, baseless hatred, that God's only going to do so much. That ultimately what happened was people were behaving with such destructive attitudes towards each other that there was nothing that God could do to save the temple. Sinat chinam, baseless hatred, refers to how people really just hated each other. And that hatred not only affected their own communal life, but it also helped to bring about the destruction of the temple. It damaged not just their relationships with one another, but it damaged their relationship with God. And there's a story that's told in Gittin about it. It's called the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. We'll read through it. We'll talk about it as we go. It says, "The destruction of Jerusalem came through a Kamsa and a Bar Kamsa in this way. A certain man had a friend Kamsa and an enemy Bar Kamsa. He once made a party and said to his servant, 'Go and bring Kamsa.' The man went and brought Bar Kamsa." So two people with really similar names. Bar Kamsa means son of Kamsa, but I think the whole point is, there was a mix-up with the male. Guy was throwing a party. He wanted to invite Kamsa. The invitation accidentally went to Bar Kamsa instead. So the man went and brought Bar Kamsa. And when the man who gave the party found him there, he said, "See, you tell tales about me. What are you doing here? Get out." Bar Kamsa doesn't like this guy. This guy doesn't like Bar Kamsa. They're not friends. So when he sent out the invitation to his party and it accidentally goes to Bar Kamsa rather than Kamsa, and Bar Kamsa shows up, the host of the party is furious. And he embarrasses him. He says, "What are you doing here? Get out." Said the other, "Since I am here, let me stay, and I will pay you for whatever I eat and drink." Meaning maybe Bar Kamsa showed up because he thought this invitation was a way of mending their relationship, that it was a way to kind of put behind them whatever it was that happened between them. But now that he's there and he sees that he's not wanted, he's saying, look, big misunderstanding, but don't chase me out. That'll be humiliating. That'll be embarrassing. Let me just pay for my own food. It's a beautiful banquet. It must have cost you $100 a plate. Let me pay the $100 or, whatever it was for the feast. He, the host, said, no, I won't. Bar Kamsa said, then let me give you half the cost of the party. Can you imagine? No, said the other. Then let me pay for the whole party. Can you imagine how embarrassed this guy's thinking he's going to be if he gets shown the door? That he's willing to pay the entire cost of a party that the host doesn't even want him at. The host will get all the credit for throwing a party, but he won't have to bear any of the cost. Can you imagine? The guy must have hated him so much, he said no. And he grabbed him in his hands and he put him out. Said the other, meaning Bar Kamsa, who was just humiliated. He offered to pay for the whole cost of the party, but was just humiliated by being shown the door. He said, since the rabbis were sitting there and did not stop him, this shows they agreed with him. The rabbis must have been other guests at the party. So the guy's throwing a big party, everyone's there, including all the rabbis, and the rabbis see what just happened, and they said absolutely nothing. So Bar Kamsa assumes that they agreed with him. I will go and inform against them to the government. The government means the Roman government, the Roman administration. He went and said to the emperor. Emperor is probably not the literal emperor. It's probably just another word meaning the Roman government. The Jews are rebelling against you. He said, the Roman said, how can I tell? Bar Kamsa said, send them an offering and see whether they will offer it on the altar. So he sent him with a fine calf. And while on the way, he made a blemish on its upper lip, or as some say, on the white of its eye, in a place where Jews would count it as a blemish, but they, meaning the Romans, did not. So what's going on here is the Romans are in charge, but the temple is still standing. The Romans haven't destroyed it yet. There's no war yet. It's a Jewish temple. They offer sacrifices to God. Bar Kamsa is saying, look, they are so upset with you that they won't even accept a Roman sacrifice in their temple. And so when the Romans send a sacrifice, there's different rules between Jews and Romans over what counts as a blemished animal, because you don't want to offer something that's blemished to God. God's supposed to get the best of the best. So Bar Kamsa makes sure that there's something on it that counts as a blemish for Jews, but not a blemish for the Romans, meaning Jewish authorities would reject it. And the Romans would say, why? It's fine. Anyways, despite this, it says the rabbis were inclined to offer it in order not to offend the government, meaning there's more important things in the world than offering up a non-blemished animal at the temple. Important as it is, God should get only the best, but at the same time, you don't want to cause trouble. You don't want to offend the government. That could bring trouble. Here comes the guy. Rabbi Zechariah ben Abculus said to them, people will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar. So you got one guy, Zach, Rabbi Zechariah, and he's saying, you know what? We really need to not offer blemished animals on the altar. So then they come up with option 2, even better than option 1. They then proposed to kill Bar Kamsa so that he should not go and inform against them. Now, Bar Kamsa is trying to start a war here. So if that sounds awful, it is awful. But remember, what's at stake here is war. They proposed to kill Bar Kamsa so that he should not go and inform against them. But Rabbi Zechariah ben Abculus said to them, is one who makes a blemish on consecrated animals to be put to death? So here's what Bar Kamsa did. He put a blemish on the animal that the Romans were going to offer. Zechariah's like, you can't kill him for that, which, I'm kind of with Zechariah on this one. But maybe they should have offered the animal to begin with. Rabbi Yochanan thereupon remarked, through the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Abculus, our house, that means the temple, has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves exiled from our land. Because they eventually did not accept the Roman offering. Romans got upset. Rome believed that that was a sign that Jews were about to rebel against them. It brought on war. Ultimately, the temple was destroyed. So this version of Sinat Chinam is not one where this sect was against that sect. the Sadducees against the Pharisees against the Zealots and everybody kind of at each other's throat. Rather, what it's trying to say is that individual acts of sinat chinam, individual acts of baseless hatred, help to bring down the entire project, the temple. That because one guy threw a party and a guy he didn't like to showed up because he accidentally got the invitation, that caused such a dispute, such a public row, that feelings were hurt. And when feelings are hurt, people sometimes act in destructive ways, and it just snowballed. How often do small things become medium things, become big things, one after another after another? That's the story that's commonly told about Tisha B'Av, one of the lessons to take from it. It's a warning sign that sinat chinam, baseless hatred, it might start off feeling like it's coming out of something small and isolated, a party, an invitation to a party, the technicalities of how to pray to God properly, blemished, not blemished. But ultimately, these things that feel like they belong in one corner of the world have a habit of growing and growing and growing and taking over. So that's a lesson for Tisha B'Av. The antidote to that is often said to be ahava sinam, baseless love. That if people can hate for little reason or no reason, that perhaps we can show love for some reason. So Tisha B'Av starts on this coming Monday evening, goes through the next day. I encourage people to take a moment sometime over the course of that day to think about it. It really is a way to connect with Jewish history, at least certain parts of Jewish history. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're looking forward to a return to what Jewish life was like thousands of years ago. It doesn't need to mean that we want the temple to be rebuilt. But what it does mean is that we see ourselves, we Jews see ourselves as part of our people through the good time and the bad. And for the bad times, we remember the bad times. And for the good times, we'll celebrate those too at the appropriate time. There's another tradition that on Tisha B'Av, we don't exchange pleasantries, no small talk, so no hi, how are you, good to see you. So instead of that, I'll just simply say, good grief.